Why did the room feel quieter the moment she sat down, like something unseen had entered before her? The dining facility at Joint Operations Base Orion was never truly silent. Even at its calmest, it breathed. Trays scraped, boots shuffled, laughter rose and fell in careless waves. It was the sound of people pretending the next briefing wasn't always closer than it felt. And in the middle of that controlled noise, she sat alone. Evelyn Thorne chose the smallest table against the wall, not out of loneliness, out of habit. Walls meant limits, angles, predictability. After 2 decades of service, her body made decisions before her mind bothered to ask why. Back to the wall, eyes scanning reflections in steel surfaces, hands relaxed, never idle. She wore plain coveralls, no patches, no visible rank, a uniform meant to erase a person rather than define one. That was the point. She lifted a spoon of soup, steam rose, she waited, not because it was hot but because patience had become instinct. The room didn't see her, that invisibility was earned, carefully cultivated. Invisibility meant freedom. Around her the base performed itself. Army Rangers with loud confidence, pilots half unzipped from flight suits, Marines who filled space simply by existing in it, youthful certainty, loud voices trying to convince themselves they were ready. She had once sounded like that too, a long time ago. The first laugh came sharp, artificial, too close. She didn't look up. Boots stopped near her table. A presence leaned in, close enough that she could smell energy drink and cheap cologne. Someone trying to feel bigger than they were. "Well, look at this," a voice said, loud enough to travel. "Hold table to yourself." She set her spoon down gently, metal against plastic, a quiet sound, deliberate. Another voice snickered, then another. A semicircle formed. She could feel them even without looking, young, restless, fresh out of proving grounds they mistook for mastery. She stayed still. "Hey," one said, leaning forward, "you hearing this?" A chair groaned as weight pressed against her table, an intentional violation, a test. "So what's your deal?" the main voice continued. "Laundry, maintenance, or you just here to brood?" Laughter rippled. Nearby conversation slowed, not stopped, just slowed. People noticed. Few intervened. This kind of moment was common currency, and it never felt worth the cost. She watched the soup ripple faintly, thought about the places she'd eaten worse meals under worse skis. "I'm just curious," the voice pressed. "On a base like this, respect matters, and respect starts with knowing who's who." Silence stretched, the kind that unsettles people who mistake noise for control. "So," he said, leaning closer, "what's your rank, little lady?" The question landed heavier than he knew. She lifted her head. Her eyes moved slowly left to right. She met each face, cataloged them. Youth, ego, uncertainty buried under bravado. When she spoke, her voice didn't rise. It didn't harden. It simply arrived. "You have a choice," she said calmly. "You can return to your table, or you can continue this interaction and accept what follows." The room seemed to lean in. The soldier blinked, scoffed. "Documentation, what are you gonna do? Write me up in a diary?" She held his gaze. "My rank," she said quietly, "is Senior Chief Petty Officer, United States Navy." The cafeteria froze. It wasn't dramatic. No gasps, no movement, just the sudden, unmistakable absence of sound, like a breath held too long. The meaning hit them one by one, not slowly, inevitably. An E8, senior enlisted, the spine of the military, the kind of rank that didn't shout because it didn't need to. Faces drained of color, smirks vanished. One of them looked physically ill. She watched it register, then she picked up her spoon again. The dismissal was complete. She finished her meal in silence, stood, walked past eyes that no longer dared meet hers, deposited her tray, turned down a hallway marked authorized personnel only. A thumbprint, a click. Darkness welcomed her home. The SCIF hummed softly. Blue and amber lights pulsed like a heartbeat. She exhaled, not relief but familiarity. She logged the incident, clean, precise, no emotion, facts only. Because facts, when handled correctly, always outlast noise. She leaned back once the report was sealed, the insult already fatting into irrelevance. Outside, people would talk about what they'd seen. Inside, she returned to the real war, one without uniforms, where silence carried more weight than gunfire. And she didn't yet know that the smallest moment in a cafeteria had already begun to echo forward, toward something far larger than respect. Something that would test not her rank, but her restraint. What happens when silence becomes the only warning anyone gets? The SCIF didn't care about pride, or embarrassment, or rank. It responded only to precision. Evelyn preferred it that way. Inside these walls, she didn't have to explain herself. The machines understood her language. Signals scrolled past her screen, noise layered over noise. Civilian chatter, friendly transmissions, atmospheric interference. Most analysts hunted messages. Evelyn hunted absence. She built baselines, libraries of quiet, because when something new arrived, it never announced itself loudly. It whispered, and only those trained to listen without expectation ever heard it. 2 days passed like that: coffee, data, stillness. Then the summons arrived. A formal inquiry, a complaint, filed by the same soldier who'd asked her for her rank. She read it once, no reaction, then again carefully. He had rewritten the moment, cast himself as concerned, her as hostile, a familiar tactic, preemptive offense dressed as professionalism. She felt something, not anger, fatigue, the kind that came from seeing the same pattern play out across decades. The system wasn't broken, it was simply predictable. She acknowledged the notice, linked her report, said nothing else. Facts didn't need commentary. But something in her shifted. That evening the base prepared for an exercise. C4I electronic warfare. Stress testing systems under simulated attack. She reviewed the parameters quietly. Oracle's wrath. Red team known for creativity, aggression. She adjusted her monitors, set passive triggers not to interfere, just to observe. When the alarms began, she felt it before she heard it. Latency anomalies, drift patterns, the kind of instability that didn't come from jamming. This wasn't noise. This was corruption. In the operations center, panic brewed fast. Systems fought themselves. Maps flickered. Commands echoed unanswered. She stood at the back until the pattern revealed itself. Then she moved. No announcement, no request. She plugged in. They aren't attacking the signal, she said calmly. They're hiding inside it. No one argued, not because they understood, but because certainty sounds different when it's real. She traced the heartbeat, found the master, didn't kill it. Redirected it. 90 seconds later, the base breathed again. Silence returned, different this time. Not ignorance. Ugh. And across the room, one soldier understood, fully, painfully, that power had never looked the way he thought it did. Why does the hardest lesson never come with raised voices? The briefing room was sterile, windowless, honest. Truth doesn't need scenery. Evelyn stood at ease while ranks far above hers absorbed what had happened. A real weapon, a near-peer threat, neutralized quietly. When her background was revealed, no pride surfaced, only confirmation. She had never hidden who she was. People had simply failed to ask the right questions. The complaint collapsed under its own weight. Video, reports, contrast. The young soldier stood pale in the corner, watching his future narrow. She didn't look at him. She didn't need to. Later in the corridor, he stopped her, saluted, not casually but completely. A surrender. She acknowledged it with a nod. Nothing more. Because redemption isn't given. It's earned in silence. What remains when recognition finally arrives, but isn't needed anymore. Back in the SCIF, Evelyn logged one final note. Correction was achieved. She closed the file. The servers hummed. Outside, a base learned a lesson it would repeat for years. Inside, she moved on. Because dignity doesn't argue. It doesn't announce itself. Sometimes, it simply acts. What does it feel like when respect doesn't arrive as an apology, but as silence that suddenly weighs more than noise? The hallway swallowed her footsteps as she moved away from the dining facility, the echo soft, controlled, familiar. Evelyn Thorne didn't rush. She never rushed after confrontation. Speed suggested reaction. Reaction suggested emotion. And emotion, when mishandled, left fingerprints everywhere. Behind her, the cafeteria was still frozen in the aftermath of a single sentence. She didn't need to look back to know that. She could feel it, the way rooms remembered moments like that. The way sound returned cautiously, as if afraid to offend. She turned left into a corridor few people used unless they knew exactly where they were going. White walls, fluorescent lighting, no windows, the kind of place where purpose replaced personality. Her thumb pressed against the biometric panel. Green light, click. Inside, the SCIF greeted her the way it always did, without judgment. Cold air, the low, steady hum of servers, blue and amber LEDs pulsing like a measured heartbeat. This room didn't care who she was to anyone else. It cared only that she was precise. She set her tray down on a side counter, untouched dessert abandoned without thought. Hunger was contextual. Right now, her body had already moved past it. She sat at the steel desk and woke the monitor. The screen bloomed to life, flooding the room with cascading data. To most people, it would have looked like chaos. To Evelyn, it was a language. She opened a new incident log. Date, time, location. Her fingers moved without hesitation, the words clinical, stripped of ego. She didn't describe tone. She didn't speculate intent. She documented exactly what was said when it was said and who said it. She listed camera angles the way a surgeon listed instruments. Because memory lied, systems didn't. As she typed, her face remained neutral, but beneath that calm a quieter conflict stirred. Not anger, not hurt. Something older, wearier. She had been underestimated her entire career. Not always loudly, often politely, sometimes with smiles, sometimes with silence that assumed she would fill the gaps for others, clean up after them, soften their mistakes. Early on, she had fought it, tried to prove herself in the ways the institution expected, louder, sharper, harder. It had taken years to understand that wasn't strength, that was compliance in disguise. Real power, she'd learned, was choosing when not to engage. She saved the file, encrypted it, closed it. 15 minutes clean. She leaned back in the chair and let the cool air wash over her skin. The incident already felt distant, filed away in the part of her mind reserved for completed tasks. Outside, Kane would replay the moment again and again, trying to find the exact second everything went wrong. He would convince himself it had been unfair, or humiliating, or personal. It was. It was procedural. Her screen refreshed automatically, pulling her attention back to the work that mattered. Background electronic emissions, frequency noise, the quiet spaces between transmissions where threats like to hide. She adjusted her headset and let the world narrow. Hours passed like minutes when she worked. Time became irrelevant. There was only pattern and anomaly, order and deviation. She was deep into a spectrum map when a subtle fluctuation caught her eye. Not alarming, barely measurable, the kind of thing most systems filtered out as background error. Evelyn leaned forward. She isolated the trace, ran it against her baseline library. It didn't match. She didn't smile. Discoveries like that didn't bring satisfaction. They brought responsibility. She tagged it, logged the timestamp, set passive monitors. Whatever it wasn't ready yet. Neither was she. The next 48 hours unfolded in disciplined monotony. Sleep in short, efficient blocks. Coffee that tasted like nothing. Data that tasted like truth. The cafeteria incident didn't return to her thoughts, not until the summons arrived. Encrypted, formal, polite. Preliminary inquiry. She opened the attached complaint. Kane's words stared back at her, rearranged into something almost unrecognizable. Concern, courtesy, misunderstanding. He painted himself as the guardian of order, her as the disruptor. Evelyn read it twice, slowly. There it was, the pivot. The institutional maneuver she'd seen too many times. Strike first. Frame the narrative. Force the other party to defend themselves. A flicker of something tightened in her chest. Not fear, not even irritation. Disappointment. Not in him, in the predictability of it all. She closed the file and sent a single response. Acknowledged. Then she linked her original report to his complaint, cross-referenced timestamps, camera IDs, language. She didn't argue. Facts didn't argue. She returned to her work, but the earlier anomaly lingered at the edge of her focus. The signal she'd tagged hadn't disappeared. It had settled, like something holding its breath. She pulled up the base exercise schedule without conscious decision. Oracle's Wrath. C4I stress test. Red team engagement. Her eyes moved over the parameters. Frequency hopping protocols, firmware versions, encryption layers. Something didn't sit right. She cross-checked the anomaly's timestamp with recent firmware updates. A match. Barely. Enough to matter. Evelyn exhaled slowly. This wasn't revenge. This wasn't curiosity. This was duty. She rerouted a fraction of her system's processing power to passive observation mode, setting alerts that would wake her instantly if the exercise deviated beyond expected thresholds. She wouldn't interfere. Unless she had to. That night the base transformed. Red lights, klaxons, simulated urgency designed to mimic the real thing closely enough to raise heart rates. In the operations center, confidence was high. The candidates moved with rehearsed precision. Kane's voice carried, steady, assertive, eager to prove something. Evelyn stood at the back of the room, unannounced, unintroduced, watching. At first, everything behaved as predicted. Then latency crept in. Milliseconds, then seconds. Not noise, not jamming. Corruption. Her alerts pulsed softly against her wrist. She stepped forward. As panic spread, she saw the same pattern she'd sensed earlier begin to unfold. A system attacking itself. A parasite hidden inside trust. When she reached the auxiliary console, no one stopped her. Authority recognizes certainty even before it understands it. She plugged in. "They're not blocking us," she said evenly. "They're riding us." The room stilled. She traced the heartbeat, found the master, watched it adapt. Elegant, dangerous. She smiled faintly, not with amusement but respect. Whoever built this knew what they were doing. So did she. She sent one packet. Then waited. The map steadied, systems recovered, the base exhaled. 90 seconds. When silence returned, it wasn't the awkward kind from the cafeteria. It was reverent. Across the room, Kane stared at her like someone seeing depth for the first time and realizing he'd been drowning all along. Evelyn disconnected her pad and stepped back. She didn't look at him. She didn't need to. Because the loudest lessons were never delivered with raised voices. They arrived quietly and stayed forever. Why did the room feel smaller? Once everyone realized what she had just done. No one spoke at first. The operations center, moments ago drowning in alarms and overlapping voices, now existed in a vacuum so complete it felt unnatural. Screens glowed steady green. Systems breathed normally again. The crisis had passed, but no one moved as if motion itself might shatter whatever fragile order had been restored. Evelyn Thorne stood at the auxiliary console, already disconnecting her data pad. Her hands were calm. Her breathing was even. To her, the emergency had ended the moment the heartbeat signal collapsed. Everything after that was administrative. Behind her, disbelief began to ripple outward. The base commander, Colonel Marcus Thorne, stared at the restored map as though it might betray him again. He had spent his career trusting layers, doctrine, redundancy, expert teams. Watching a single enlisted woman unravel a threat none of those layers had contained left him unsettled in a way he couldn't immediately name. Lieutenant Colonel Wallace broke the silence first. "Senior Chief," he said carefully, "what exactly did you just do?" Evelyn turned, slowly, not to command attention, but because the question deserved an answer. "I listened," she said. "That was all." It wasn't meant to be clever or dismissive, it was simply true. The chief network engineer stepped closer, eyes still locked on the system metrics. "That malware," he said, almost to himself. "It wasn't just adaptive, it was anticipatory." "Yes," Evelyn replied. "It assumed we'd respond emotionally, forcefully, it counted on noise." She paused, then added, "It wasn't designed to beat us. It was designed to make us beat ourselves." The words landed hard. Across the room, inside the glass enclosure reserved for the Special Forces candidates, Kane felt his chest tighten. He had been trained to recognize threats, to act decisively, to dominate uncertainty, but nothing in his training had prepared him for this realization, that the most dangerous enemy he'd ever encountered hadn't fired a shot or broken a rule. It had simply waited for him to panic. And worse, she hadn't panicked at all. The colonel finally found his voice. "Senior Chief Thorne," he said, stepping forward, "I want a full report." "You'll have it," she replied. "But first, I recommend isolating Server Cluster 7, subnode Delta. There's residual code still dormant. It won't react without a master signal, but it should be scrubbed." The chief engineer nodded vigorously, already barking orders. Teams moved again, this time with clarity. The emergency had become a lesson. Evelyn stepped away from the console, retreating toward the back wall where she'd started. She preferred edges. Edges let you see the whole picture. As she moved, Kane's eyes followed her. He felt something unfamiliar rising behind his ribs, not fear exactly, something heavier, recognition. He remembered the cafeteria, the way she hadn't raised her voice, the way her silence had felt complete. At the time, he'd thought it was weakness. Now he understood how wrong he'd been. The room slowly resumed its rhythm, but nothing was the same. Conversations were quieter, movements more deliberate. People glanced at Evelyn when they thought she wasn't looking, and quickly looked away when they realized she might be. She left without ceremony. The hallway outside the operations center was cool and narrow, the lights humming softly overhead. Her boots echoed once, then settled into a steady rhythm. Only when the doors slid shut behind her did she allow herself a long breath. Not relief. Release. Her wrist console buzzed gently. A secure message from Lieutenant Colonel Wallace. "Formal inquiry scheduled, 800, Conference Room B." She acknowledged it without comment. The inquiry didn't worry her. It never had. But beneath that professional calm, something more complicated stirred. The cafeteria incident, the complaint, the exercise. Three threads, now braided tightly together. She had spent years operating in the margins, essential but unseen, necessary but uncelebrated. That anonymity had been protection. Tonight it felt thinner. Back in the SCIF, the servers greeted her like old friends. She dimmed the lights and pulled up the captured data from the incident. The Cerberus code, she'd named it instinctively, long before anyone else would, lay dissected across her screen. Elegant, ruthless, patient. She traced its logic with a kind of professional respect that bordered on admiration. Whoever had built this wasn't careless. They understood human systems as well as technical ones. They knew people would react with force, with urgency. They had counted on it. She broken it by refusing to play. As she worked, memories surfaced uninvited. Her first deployment, a forward operating base with sand in everything and certainty in nothing, being the only woman in the room and not the youngest, being spoken over, dismissed. Once, ignored entirely during a briefing until she repeated her analysis through a male colleague's mouth. She learned then what silence could do, how it could either erase you or sharpen you. She had chosen the latter. The night passed quietly, too quietly. When morning came, she stood outside conference room B 5 minutes early. Habit. The corridor smelled faintly of cleaning solution and old coffee. She clasped her hands behind her back and waited. Inside, voices murmured, authority, paper shuffling, a system preparing to judge something it barely understood. When the door opened, she entered without hesitation. Colonel Thorne sat at the head of the table, Wallace to his right, a civilian on the screen at the far end, stern, composed, watching everything. Specialist Kane stood in the corner at attention. He didn't look at her. The colonel gestured for her to stand at ease. "Senior Chief," he began, "this inquiry concerns two related matters, a formal complaint filed against you and the events of last night." Evelyn nodded once. The civilian on the screen spoke next. "Senior Chief Thorne," he said, voice calm but edged with weight. "I'm Deputy Director Graves, National Security Agency." She met the screen without reaction. Titles mattered less than intent. "What you encountered last night," Graves continued, "was not a training artifact. It was a live weapon, one we've been tracking unsuccessfully for months." The room shifted. Kane's breath caught. Graves went on, "Your methodology, frankly, we didn't think it was possible." Evelyn listened, absorbed, responded only when necessary. When the colonel finally pulled up Kane's complaint alongside her report, the contrast was undeniable. Emotion versus precision, story versus record. Kane stared at the floor, his jaw clenched so tightly it ached. The verdict came swiftly. The complaint was dismissed. Kane was ordered to face disciplinary action. But what followed surprised Evelyn more than any accusation ever could. The colonel stood. "Senior Chief Thorne," he said, voice heavy with something close to regret. "On behalf of this command, I apologize." The word hung in the air. Apologies were rare currency in places like this, often too rare. She inclined her head. "Acknowledged, sir." Nothing more. As she turned to leave, she felt it, the shift. The room no longer saw her as invisible, nor as a curiosity. They saw her as consequence. In the hallway outside, footsteps hurried behind her. She stopped. Kane stood 5 paces away, rigid, pale, eyes fixed straight ahead. Slowly, precisely, he raised his hand in salute. It wasn't casual, it wasn't practiced. It was absolute. Evelyn studied him for a long moment, saw the shame, the understanding, the fracture and the beginning of something better. She returned the salute with a single nod. Then she walked on. Back to the quiet. Back to the work. Because respect that arrives loudly is often temporary. But respect learned in silence endures. What happens after respect is earned, when the silence that once protected you starts to feel heavier than the noise ever did. The corridor swallowed her again as she walked away from Kane, the echo of his boots fatting behind her. Evelyn Thorne didn't slow. She didn't quicken her pace either. The salute lingered in her peripheral awareness longer than she wanted it to. Not because it mattered, but because it marked a shift she hadn't asked for. Anonymity, once lost, never returned the same way. Back inside the SCIF, the door sealed with a soft hydraulic hiss. The familiar hum wrapped around her like insulation. Blue and amber lights pulsed steadily, indifferent to rank, apology, or revelation. Machines didn't care that the room outside now spoke her name differently. She preferred that. She sat, activated the terminal, and pulled up the Cerberus code again. The NSA would dissect it soon, pull it apart with teams and theories and briefings. But for now, it was still hers. The first contact always left an imprint, subtle insights that disappeared once too many hands touched the problem. She traced the logic tree again, not to admire it, to understand the person behind it. This wasn't brute force malware. It wasn't built by desperation or arrogance. It was patient, restrained. It behaved the way she did, listening first, acting only when necessary. That unsettled her. She wondered briefly what kind of life its architect lived. Whether they sat alone somewhere, drinking cold coffee, watching the world reduce itself to patterns. Whether they, too, knew the cost of being right too often and acknowledged too late. The thought lingered longer than she liked. Her wrist console vibrated. Another message. This one wasn't formal. Phoenix Graves wrote, "We'll need you in 48 hours. Full integration team, Fort Meade." She closed the message without responding. 48 hours was generous. It meant they were still deciding how much of her to reveal and to whom. Visibility was never free. It came with expectations, questions, demands. She had spent years mastering the art of being indispensable without being exposed. That balance was about to be tested. Outside the SCIF, the base adjusted. Word traveled the way it always did, imperfectly, emotionally, exaggerated at the edges. The story changed with each retelling. Some said she'd shut down the base to prove a point. Others said she'd saved it from an attack no one else had even seen. Her rank climbed in rumors. Her past expanded. Evelyn ignored it all. But she felt the difference. People didn't cut in front of her in line anymore. Conversations stopped when she entered rooms, not out of disrespect but caution. Eyes lingered, not hostile, curious. She hated curiosity more than hostility. The next day she attended a briefing she wasn't scheduled for. No one questioned it. Chairs shifted to make space she hadn't asked for. She took a seat near the back, as always. The briefing officer stumbled once, corrected himself, glanced at her before continuing. She stared at the screen, pretending not to notice. The internal conflict crept in slowly, not dramatic, not painful. Unfamiliar. She had always known who she was in the quiet, the margins, the unseen corners where the real work happened. Now the edges were looking back at her. Visibility meant accountability beyond performance. It meant becoming a symbol. She had never wanted to be one. That afternoon she received a request, not an order, a request from Colonel Thorne. Coffee. She considered declining, then accepted. They met in a small office overlooking the flight line. Jets moved in the distance, precise and loud, a reminder that some power preferred spectacle. The colonel spoke carefully, apologized again, this time without ceremony. He admitted failure, not hers, his, institutional blindness, assumptions built into systems older than either of them. Evelyn listened. She always did. "You could have demanded consequences," he said finally. "You didn't." "No," she replied. "I documented them." He nodded, as if that distinction mattered more now than it had before. "People like Specialist Kane," he continued. "They think authority comes from being seen, from being loud. And sometimes," Evelyn said quietly, "they learn it comes from being precise." The colonel smiled faintly, Not with humor, with understanding. As she left, she felt the weight shift again. Not lighter, just different. That night's sleep came unevenly. Dreams bled into memory. A desert horizon, radios crackling. A convoy stalled because no one trusted the quiet voice on the net warning them the road ahead was wrong. She had been right then, too. The cost had been high. She woke before the alarm, sat in the dark, let the past pass without chasing it. 48 hours later, she stood on a transport headed east. The SCIF at Fort Meade was larger, brighter, more people, more noise pretending to be urgency. Teams waited for her not reverently but intently. Analysts, engineers, operators. Graves met her at the door. "We didn't expect this solution," he said. "You changed how we think about the threat." She nodded. "Good." They worked for hours, long ones. The code revealed more secrets under her hands, not just how it attacked, but what it had already learned. Maps, protocols, behavioral models. Someone asked her how she'd seen it when others hadn't. She answered honestly, "I wasn't looking for it." Confusion followed. She clarified, "I was listening for what didn't belong." That answer didn't satisfy everyone. It wasn't teachable in a slide deck, but it was true. By the end of the second day, a decision had been made without asking her. A task force would be built around her methodology. She would lead it. The announcement came quietly, official, irrevocable. Evelyn felt something fracture inside her, not fear, not pride. Grief. For the quiet she was about to lose. That evening, alone in temporary quarters, she stood at the window watching lights blink across the complex. Somewhere inside those buildings, decisions were being shaped that would ripple outward, built on her work, her instincts, her way of seeing. She wondered if Kane was back in his barracks, staring at the ceiling, replaying the salute again and again, wondering how close he'd come to missing the lesson entirely. She hoped he'd remember the silence more than the humiliation. Before sleeping, she opened her personal log, not the official one, the private archive she kept encrypted beyond clearance levels. She typed a single line. "Visibility is a responsibility, not a reward." She closed the file. Tomorrow the work would continue, louder now, more exposed, but still grounded in the same truth she'd learned long ago. That real strength didn't need to announce itself. And sometimes the most dangerous thing you could do was finally be seen. What happens when the past you buried quietly decides it isn't finished with you yet? The aircraft touched down just before dawn, the tires kissing the runway with a softness that felt undeserved. Evelyn Thorne barely noticed. She was already elsewhere, mentally tracing patterns that had followed her across the country, across years, across versions of herself she thought she'd outgrown. Fort Meade woke early. It always had. Even in stillness it felt alert, like a mind that never quite slept. As she stepped onto the tarmac, the cold bit through her jacket, sharp and grounding. She welcomed it. Physical sensation was easier than reflection. A car waited, no markings, no conversation. Inside the vehicle, she watched the compound pass by, layers of security folding inward like a puzzle designed to discourage curiosity. She had worked in places like this before. Not often, not recently. Visibility again. The task force briefing room was already full when she entered. Conversations softened, not stopped, just lowered. People didn't stare outright. They studied her the way engineers studied unfamiliar systems, carefully, with intent. Graves stood near the display wall. He didn't introduce her with ceremony. He didn't need to. "This is Phoenix," he said simply. Not senior chief, not doctor, not analyst. Just Phoenix. That name carried more weight than any title. They began immediately. Cerberus wasn't alone. It had siblings, variants, fragments, echoes. The code wasn't just a weapon. It was a philosophy, adaptive, patient. built to exploit not systems but assumptions. Evelyn listened more than she spoke at first. She always did, letting others reveal how they thought told her more than their data ever could. Someone asked when the next attack would come. She didn't answer. Instead, she asked, "Why do you think it already has?" Silence followed, productive silence. She walked them through what she'd seen, not just technically but behaviorally, how Cerberus waited, how it learned the rhythm of human response, how it relied on panic more than precision. "It doesn't fear us," she said quietly. "It counts on us." Hours passed, coffee cooled untouched, notes filled screens, plans formed. And slowly, subtly, she felt it, that tightening again. The familiar pressure of being needed in ways that went beyond skill, being leaned on, being elevated. She had never sought command. Leadership for her had always been situational, earned in moments, released when the moment passed. This was different. By the end of the day, she wasn't just advising. She was deciding. That night alone in her quarters, the quiet felt wrong, too open, too exposed. She sat on the edge of the bed and removed her boots carefully, the way she always had. Ritual mattered. It reminded her who she was when the noise tried to redefine her. Her console blinked softly. A message flagged personal priority. She hesitated before opening it. It wasn't from Graves. It wasn't from the task force. It was from an address she hadn't seen in over a decade. A unit designation, long since deactivated. Her breath slowed. The message was brief. "We saw what you did. We need you." Same place, same silence. No signature. She didn't need one. Her past hadn't followed her loudly. It never did. It waited, just like Cerberus. Memories surfaced uninvited. Night operations. Radios whispering codes only a few people on Earth understood. Decisions made with incomplete information and permanent consequences. A mission she'd never logged properly. A choice she'd never forgiven herself for. She closed her eyes. Back then she had been younger, sharper in some ways, more certain. She had believed that being right was enough. It hadn't been. The cost had been measured in absence. She hadn't spoken to anyone from that unit since the debrief that never really ended. They'd all scattered, promoted, reassigned, disappeared into other shadows. Seeing the message felt like hearing a door unlock in a room she'd sealed for survival. The next morning, she didn't mention it. She briefed, planned, redirected resources, built frameworks designed not to fight Cerberus, but to understand the people who would deploy it next. Midway through the session, an analyst asked her quietly, "How do you stay calm when everything's on the line?" Evelyn considered the question, longer than necessary. "Because panic feels like action," she said finally. "And action feels responsible, but most of the time it's just noise." The analyst nodded, not fully understanding, but sensing truth. By afternoon, confirmation arrived. Cerberus activity detected overseas. Not an attack, a test. Someone probing defenses the way a pianist tested keys before a performance. Evelyn marked the location, compared it to the old message. The overlap was impossible to ignore. She requested a secure channel. When Graves joined, she didn't waste time. "There's another group watching this," she said. "Not adversarial, adjacent." He frowned. "You're sure?" "Yes." "Can we trust them?" She paused. "That depends," she said carefully, "on whether they've forgiven me." The silence on the other end stretched. "Phoenix," Graves said eventually, "whatever this is." "I'll handle it," she replied, not assertive, certain. Permission arrived without being spoken. That night she stood outside under a sky washed pale by light pollution. The stars were faint but persistent. She remembered nights when they'd been blinding, overwhelming, reminders of how small everything else was. She thought of Cain again, not with irritation but understanding. He had believed power announced itself. She had once believed certainty protected you. Both had been wrong. Her console chimed once more. Coordinates. Time. She typed a response. On my way. No explanation. She packed lightly, always did. The essentials never changed. As the transport lifted off hours later, she watched Fort Meade shrink beneath her. Another layer shed, another identity adjusted. She wasn't running from the task force. She was moving toward something unfinished. Somewhere ahead, a mission waited that wouldn't care about rank or recognition, or how loudly her name was spoken. It would care only about judgment, about restraint, about whether she had learned at last how to live with the consequences of being right. As the aircraft cut through cloud, Evelyn closed her eyes, not to rest but to listen. Because the quiet ahead wasn't empty. It was expectant. And this time, she wasn't invisible anymore. She was accountable. What do you do when the moment you've spent your life preparing for finally arrives, and it asks for more than skill? The transport descended without ceremony, slipping through a ceiling of cloud that looked deceptively calm. From above, the world always lied first. Evelyn Thorne knew that. Turbulence never announced itself. Neither did consequences. She opened her eyes as the wheels locked into place. No alarms, no rush, just the quiet finality of arrival. The location wasn't marked on any civilian map. It existed in that gray space where jurisdiction blurred and accountability thinned. A place chosen specifically because it discouraged questions. Same place, same silence. She stepped onto the tarmac and felt something settle inside her, not dread, not anticipation. Acceptance. The facility hadn't changed. Concrete, steel, angles designed to discourage comfort, a place built for people who stayed just long enough to finish what they started. Inside, familiar faces waited, older now, sharper in different ways. Some bore lines earned from time. Others carried scars that never made it into reports. No greetings, no names spoken. They didn't need them. One of them finally broke the silence. You look different. Evelyn considered the statement. I am. They moved into the operations room. Sparse, functional. A map illuminated the center table, points pulsing softly like restrained heartbeats. The threat was Cerberus, not directly. This was something born from it, an evolution, a group that had learned not just from the code but from how it had been defeated. They adapted. They're not after disruption, someone said. They're after trust. Evelyn nodded. That was always the goal. The plan unfolded slowly, carefully. No grand gestures, no heroics, just restraint layered over precision. This wasn't about stopping an attack. It was about letting one think it was succeeding, long enough to expose itself. As they worked, the past pressed closer, not as memory but as context. The mission she'd left unfinished years ago, the one that had ended with silence where voices should have been. She'd believed then that being correct was enough, that clean logic outweighed human cost. It hadn't. This time, she adjusted the parameters. Hours turned elastic. The world narrowed to decision points. Each one carried weight, not just operationally but morally. At one moment an opportunity appeared on the screen, a chance to end it decisively, permanently. Someone looked to her. We can shut it down now. Evelyn studied the data, saw the cascade that would follow. Collateral damage hidden in clean lines of code, innocent systems dragged into consequence. She shook her head. Not like this, she said. Not if we become what they expect. The silence that followed wasn't disagreement. It was trust. They waited. When the window finally opened, it was subtle. A deviation so small it would have been dismissed by anyone rushing to act. Evelyn wasn't rushing. She moved, redirected, contained. The network stilled, not dead, not destroyed, neutralized, disarmed without spectacle. It was over. No cheers followed, no exhale of relief, just the quiet understanding that something dangerous had passed and something harder had been upheld. Later, alone in a narrow corridor, she leaned her forehead briefly against the cool concrete, not from exhaustion, from recognition. She had made a different choice this time. Back at the facility, the team dispersed the way such teams always did, without ceremony. Promises to stay in touch that would never quite materialize. Respect shown through distance. As she prepared to leave, one of them spoke quietly. "You did right." Evelyn met his eyes. "I know." That knowledge was new, and heavier than doubt had ever been. The return journey felt longer, not physically, internally. She replayed the moment she'd chosen restraint over certainty, felt the echo of it settle deeper than any success she'd logged. When she arrived back at the base, the atmosphere had shifted again. News traveled fast in closed systems. Her role had grown, expanded beyond intention. Graves met her briefly. "You closed a door a lot of people were afraid to look behind," he said. She replied evenly, "Some doors shouldn't be kicked open." He smiled faintly. "You've changed how we think about power." She didn't respond, because power hadn't changed. Perspective had. Days later, she found herself back in the same dining facility. Different time, same noise, same choreography. She took the same table by the wall. This time people noticed. They didn't stare, they didn't whisper, but the space around her remained clear, respectful, careful. She didn't like it, but she accepted it. As she ate, a young service member hesitated nearby, nervous, unsure. "Senior Chief?" he asked quietly. She looked up. "Yes. I just wanted to say thank you for how you handled things, not just here, everywhere." Evelyn studied him for a moment, saw curiosity, admiration, the beginning of a question he hadn't yet learned how to ask. She nodded once. "Do your job well," she said, "and listen more than you speak." He smiled, relieved. "Yes, ma'am." When he left, she finished her meal slowly. Nothing dramatic happened. And that, she realized, was the point. Later that night, back in the SCIF, she opened a fresh log. Not an incident report, not a mission summary. A personal entry. She typed carefully. "There was a time I thought dignity had to be defended loudly. I was wrong." She paused, let the cursor blink. Then added the final line. "Sometimes dignity doesn't speak. It simply acts." She saved the file, encrypted it, let it disappear into the quiet archive of moments that didn't need recognition to matter. The servers hummed steadily. Outside, the base settled into its restless sleep. And Evelyn Thorne returned to the edges, not unseen but grounded, not silent but deliberate. Still listening. Because in a world obsessed with noise, the truest strength remained what it had always been. The discipline to act without needing to be heard.